Welcome to the 5th ESG Webcast. Today's topic is the corporate carbon footprint. My colleague Teresa Kühmeier and I will guide you through this topic. In the first step, I will give a general overview and clarify important terminology. In the second step, I will discuss global frameworks and frameworks on EU level in connection with the carbon footprint. My colleague will then explain to you how the corporate carbon footprint is covered in sustainability reporting and what it means for a company to account greenhouse gases. Why should companies be concerned with greenhouse gas emissions? The term climate change is familiar to many and is a constant companion in the media. Some of the impacts of climate change are already measurable or will be present in the near future. It is important to adapt to climate change as well as to mitigate its effects. What is exactly meant by the term climate change? In a nutshell, climate change means long-term change in temperatures and weather patterns. The main cause of this is the greenhouse effect. The Earth's atmosphere is made up of gases, including greenhouse gases, which allow short-wave radiation from the sun to hit the Earth. Long-wave heat radiation, which is reflected by the Earth, is absorbed by the gases and thus no longer leave the Earth's atmosphere in its entirety. To put it simply, the more greenhouse gases there are in the air, the more heat radiation remains in the Earth's atmosphere and the more the atmosphere warms up. There is the natural greenhouse effect, which prevents the Earth from freezing over, but there is also the anthropogenic greenhouse effect, the man-made greenhouse effect, which has led to a continuous increase in greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere since industrialization and thus drives global warming. In simplified terms, greenhouse gas emissions include CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. The title of this webcast is Corporate Carbon Footprint. What does corporate carbon footprint mean? It includes the company's own greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that result along the value chain. CO2 equivalents are a term that is often used in connection with the corporate carbon footprint. CO2 equivalents are used to standardize the climate impact of different greenhouse gases. For example, methane is around 25 times more harmful to the climate than CO2. In order to calculate CO2 equivalents, the so-called global warming potential is taken into account and the various greenhouse gases can be standardized as CO2 equivalents. Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are an important concept in the context of the CO2 footprint. This involves looking at the company's value chain and identifying direct and indirect emissions in connection with the company's activities. Scope 1 emissions are greenhouse gas emissions from sources owned or controlled by the company. Scope 2 emissions are greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of purchased electricity. Scope 3 emissions are other indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur along upstream or downstream activities. Now, I will briefly discuss frameworks related to climate change. On a global level, this includes the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol came into force in 2005 and represents the world's first binding treaty under international law related to climate change mitigation. The participating countries are obliged to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. The Paris Climate Agreement is also an international treaty on climate change. All EU countries have ratified the agreement. Under the Paris Climate Agreement, the goal was set to limit the increase in average global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and to aim for an increase of less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the EU level, there is the Green Deal, where the EU sets the goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. How companies are affected in this context will now be explained by my colleague, Teresa Kühmeier.
Companies that are obliged to report under the CSRD using the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, may be required, depending on the outcome of the materiality assessment, to calculate and disclose their corporate carbon footprint. You are welcome to check out our webcast on ESG reporting to see what criteria are to be fulfilled in order to fall within the reporting requirement. We can see here where in the ESRS the corporate carbon footprint is stated. There are 5 environmental standards in the ESRS that we have mapped in the dark boxes, and the first one, E1, climate change, is about climate change, and disclosure requirements E16 describes more or less that greenhouse gas emissions must be disclosed in scopes 1, 2, and 3. In the voluntary reporting or in the mandatory reporting according to NFRD, Non-Financial Reporting Directive, the directive which is now replaced more or less by the CSRD, the GRI standards are often used. These are standards of the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and they contain 8 topic standards with environmental content, which we see listed here. In the case of GRI 305, we can see that the information 305, 1, 2, and 3 is about the carbon footprint and the 3 scopes. We have just seen where the corporate carbon footprint is mapped in the ESRS and in GRI standards. Now it's about how do I get to my corporate carbon footprint. I need to do greenhouse gas accounting. One guideline on how to account is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which provides a standardized framework for measuring and managing greenhouse gas emissions. It is a partnership between the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It also involves collaborations with governments, industry associations, NGOs, companies, and organizations. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol includes various greenhouse gas accounting guidances for different audiences or sectors. What is usually the outcome of greenhouse gas accounting? You have calculated the corporate carbon footprint in tons of CO2 equivalents for 1 year, and then, for example, you can describe it per employee. What happens when you have collected all this, when you have the corporate carbon footprint and now know the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the company? You can now work on a strategy for decarbonization, and you can deal with the identification of the reduction potentials and then also set specific reduction targets for your company. This brings us to the end of this short insight into the topic corporate carbon footprint, and I would like to point out to you that we already have several published webcasts. For example, as I mentioned earlier, there is a webcast on ESG reporting according to CSRD, where we give an overview of ESRS. You will also find webcasts on sustainable finance and the EU taxonomy regulation. Stay tuned for upcoming webcasts that will give you a deep dive into ESG relevant topics. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to having you join us again for the next webcast.